This is a beautiful book. I mean, high quality paper, lots of it reminds me. Initially, I thought it looked more like a high school, maybe a high school AP textbook. But the more I got into it, it looks like a college textbook, just loaded with pictures a lot of people haven't seen and stories and details. But it's by John Dwyer, and it's the story of Oklahoma and its people. So I've invited him on the program this morning to talk about the book and the story of Oklahoma. So with all of that said, John, welcome to the Pat Campbell Show.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to visit with you and your audience, Pat.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got involved in this project.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Duncan, Oklahoma, and, Pat, in a home where our widowed mother taught my little brother Paul and I from an early age about the vibrancy and importance of our history, as well as the heroic people and themes in that history. So that's been kind of one of the themes as I've taught the last 11 years as history professor at Southern Nazarene University down in Oklahoma City, and in my previous historical works, including my War Between the States, America's Uncivil War, which is a Civil War textbook.
Right.
But all through that, Pat, has been the theme that history is not something that is or it shouldn't be, a dry recitation of facts and figures, but it's a living thing, and it's something that, as the great King Alfred of England in olden days said, it is something that the past should be given to those of us in the present to guard those in the future. So there's a moral component, there are lessons, and it should be an exciting and thrilling thing if done correctly.
Yeah, having the right teacher can make all the difference. In fact, I was just talking with a friend yesterday when I was in high school, senior year, physics. There were two teachers you could have, and the guy I got, Mr. Duncan, was fascinated because he made everything come to life. He would always start stuff with some sort of audio-visual aid to give you an idea. And I remember one of the first things we saw, you may have seen this years ago, I think it was maybe up in Washington State. There's a bunch of cars, maybe in the 40s, they're on a bridge, and the bridge starts to wave and eventually cracks apart. Some of the listeners will recognize that. And I saw that, and he showed that, and it's the first time I ever saw it, back in high school, and they're like, wow. But then he would go on to explain how and why that happened. Whereas the other teacher would talk about, the story from the physics perspective and not give you the visual. But the way you present stuff can make the difference. It can make or break kids. And with history, I've even found with my own kids going to school here, they seem to be learning a lot of facts, but I don't know that the stories have actually come to life. So what is the secret in teaching something like that?
Well, I think the secret, Pat, is, and this is something that we would hope for our children and ourselves that we would have, and that is a teacher that has passion. Probably like a lot of the folks listening right now. Back when I was in school and had Oklahoma history back in 8th or 9th grade, we had one of the best coaches in the school, but one of the worst history teachers for Oklahoma history. He was not any more excited about it than we were, Pat. It was an old book. It had no pictures,
right?
And we all kind of mailed it in, including myself. So
right.
On the other hand, if you have, and you've kind of alluded to this already, if you have a teacher that is fired up and looks at it like that teacher, as well as the folks in the classroom or just the general reader cracking open the book in the evening on their couch, that we are not just spectators, but particularly in a state history, Oklahoma, that we're really a part of, that we are participants in making the new history, then it takes on a whole new light for us.
It's interesting. I came here in 2008, and I didn't. What's that one commercial? I didn't prejudge the state. I didn't have a negative connotation of the state, but I have found in my travels that a lot of people really don't know an awful lot about Oklahoma. In fact, probably the only thing they know about is sort of the Grapes of Wrath version. It's like, wow, you're really missing out on a lot of stuff. We used to joke that how many head of cattle do you have? How many horses do you own? Do they have roads there? Do you live in teepees? That kind of stuff. Why does this state have such an image problem outside of Oklahoma?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons, Pat, and I think that's astute of you to hit on that. One of them you alluded to, the Grapes of Wrath. John Steinbeck tremendous literary work, The Grapes of Wrath, back in the late 30s. And ironically, he was a Californian, and his aim was to chastise his fellow Californians for the way that they treated the people from the Southwest and Midwest, which were not all Oklahomans, how poorly they treated them when they arrived in California. Well, his unintentional truth that came through was kind of the patronizing, condescending attitude that he had toward folks that we would call today in flyover country. And I think that, that was a famous book. It established an image that, honestly, until the heroism and valor of the state in the Oklahoma City bombing 20 years ago, I think that kind of rewrote in, the nation's and the world's eyes, wait a minute, this is not some sort of backward, toothless, group of hillbillies. This is a very different people than we thought it was. Yeah. The other thing is, and I'm sure you talk about this on your show all the time, it is flyover country. This is a part of the country. This is a state and a region that holds to values that a lot of the sophisticated folks and elites on the coast and elsewhere, they do not like. So they have a hard time identifying with the things we think are important, and the things we hold as valuable and dear, they wouldn't. Yeah,
it's funny. I went to New York. In fact, I was on Long Island at a pretty expensive restaurant with a bunch of what's considered in New York, at least, Republican businessmen. And they had known that I had moved from Orlando in 2008 to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they're there, so how do you like it? And I'm there, I love it. They actually they acted surprised. They said, really? And again, because their image of Oklahoma, it's like, clearly they've never been here. They've never been to Oklahoma City. They've never been to Tulsa. They don't know what it has to offer. I'll tell you, one of the things that surprised me when I came here is how much water we've got in Oklahoma. Because if you buy into that image, that Grapes of Wrath image, they don't have any water there. It's pretty dry, arid stuff. There's water everywhere. In fact, we've got so much water that other states, for example, Texas, want some of our water.
Yes, indeed. And Pat, I think you really tapped into a vein there that if an Oklahoma history is told in the way that we would hope it would be, in a way that would open up the creative imagination of the reader, it becomes apparent that this is a lavishly varied and different state of many regions, many topographies, green country from on one end to the red carpet country on the other. Even with the history of the Indian tribes that came, folks think of it a lot of times monolithically as just one big group. Well, the 5 Indian republics, the great, what we in the past have called the civilized tribes, the Cherokees and Choctaws that populated green country in the area around here, they were just not only a radically different group than the nomadic plains tribes, the warrior tribes, the Comanches and Kiowas and so forth that came in from the west and north, but they were actually enemies. I mean, these folks fought wars with each other, and people sit back and go, wait a minute, you mean the tribes fought against each other?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, the tribes had slaves and then intermarried with African-American slaves? The history is a lot more complex and much more intriguing and dramatic than is typically packaged and force-fed to students so that they can check off the right answers on a multiple-choice quiz at the end of the course.
I'm going to talk with John Dwyer about his new book. It's The Story of Oklahoma and Its People. And I want to walk through a couple things here. Talk about who was here before the settlers showed up, because I've had people call in that, we talk about the various tribes, the Indians. Well, there was somebody here before them. So walk me through, who was here before the settlers showed up?
Well, that's a great question. That's one reason, Pat, why we discovered along the way, and this has been a 10-and-a-half-year pilgrimage to get this book written, and it is, as you mentioned at the top, it's only volume 1 of 2. This volume goes up through statehood, 1910 roughly, but that's because there was so much incredible history before that, and we would go back thousands of years. I'll illustrate it by letting you know that as a historian, you've always got to be ready to be humbled, and you're always one question, one fact away from new humility. And this, one of many cases, happened with me when one of my students at Southern Nazarene, Kat Turby, young lady from Kingfisher, she mentioned to me that she had some arrowheads that she had dug up under a bridge near Atoka. And I was like, okay, well, that's good, you know. And she goes, well, Mr. Dwyer, could you get them dated and find that they might be pretty old? And, you know, she was a sweet young lady, and I kind of, you know, in a patronizing fashion, put her off, and she even gave me the collection. Well, after about a year, she kind of somberly asked if she could have it back, and I felt so bad, and I said, well, gosh, give me one more chance. Let me get these things dated for you. So I took them to the archaeology department at OU, and these guys' eyes opened wide the moment they saw this collection. They spread them out on the table, and they began to tell me that these arrowheads ranged from 2,000 to 3,000 to 3,500 years old.
Wow.
So there were tribes that migrated from Asia thousands of years ago into the very land that now comprises Oklahoma. And, of course, those tribes, again, they worked together, but more oftentimes they battled each other. There were warrior tribes, there were townspeople. And then, of course, long after that, eventually the European explorers began to come in, the Spaniards, the French, English, and then eventually the Americans. And so by the time you have Coronado and the Conquistadors, and by the way, Pat, that's one thing we bring out in our book. He didn't just skirt through the panhandle of Oklahoma. He took his men right up what we would call today Highway 81 in western Oklahoma, traversed the length of the state, searching, collecting, recording the beginnings of recorded history in Oklahoma, and fighting battles. And by the time that happens, you've had people here in Oklahoma for 2,000 or 3,000 years.
So when did the settlers first show up? I mean, in some sort of numbers here.
Sure. Well, of course, when the tribes were brought, those great southeastern tribes, those Indian republics, Cherokees, Choctaws, Creeks, Seminoles, and Chickasaws, they came in roughly from the really late 1700s up through the 1840s and 50s, mainly through the 1830s. But American settlers and pioneers, they came first, of course, as trappers, adventurers, soldiers, explorers through those early 1800s.
Sure.
But the real opening came following the Civil War. You know, the population was exploding, immigration from Europe, and people were looking for land. And the southern part, you know, the former Confederate states had been scalded out, had been burned out, not just the armies, but the people and their lands. So they were, many of them, looking for a new start. So you're looking at, you know, late 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s was the period that the settlers began to come in. But the huge boom was, of course, as you alluded to a moment ago, the land openings, which
right.
There were several of those, and those range from 1889 up to the beginning of the 20th century. That's when by the hundreds of thousands people came in and settled the state.
One of the things I've wondered about, as you know, somebody who's living in the modern age here, how did people survive in this state with the weather extremes, especially in the summer? I just can't, you know, I can't imagine living like it you know, back in 1910, where they weren't wearing Under Armour vented shirts and shorts and sneakers. They were, you know, fully. What was it like to live back here? How did they do it?
Well, you know, I know you've looked through the pages of the book, and you're giving me a good question there that I'm sure is prompted somewhat from what you know where I'm headed, and that is that there are numberless stories of forgotten courage, of valor and bravery of men, women, young people that came to this land, and we're talking multiple. Not just multiple Indian tribes, but different types of tribes. We're talking former slaves that came, many of them as slaves of the Indians on the Trails of Tears, and then later as freemen after the war between the states. We're talking the white settlers that came from so many different lands, speaking many different languages. And I believe, Pat, the great forgotten story of heroism is how so many of these people, and we talk about this in the book, that Oklahoma has always been the land of the second chance and sometimes the final chance. The last place people had an opportunity. For one thing, we've struggled economically, mainly because when you have land runs, that's land that's thrown open, up for grabs. It's free, and that's going to draw so many people that they can't get land anywhere else because they can't afford it.
Right.
So it draws a bunch of vigorous people that don't have much money, and that was from the start. So you have these people that the tribes, after the Trail of Tears, many times they're in these cold weather climates compared to where they come from in the southeast states, learning and sometimes dying and having diseases that they hadn't been exposed to before. You have the white pioneers, American settlers in other parts of the state also that are out there on land. They're trying to grow it, and really all it's good for is to graze buffalo and maybe cattle on. And they're trying to grow a farm up with no timber, no water, no roads, and no community support. So there are just countless stories of these that didn't get in the history books. We don't know who all these people were, Pat, but what we try to do is snapshot those we have snippets of information on and then pass forward the spirit of that, because there were a lot of people whose bones are in the ground of Oklahoma that paved the way for the opportunities that we have today.
John, a couple things here. First of all, if people want to get their hands on a copy of this book, where do we send them?
Sure. Well, you can get them locally in Tulsa at the Tulsa Historical Society.
Okay.
Also in Pryor at the Book Exchange and Bible Bookstore. Grove's got them at Sissy's Place. And then Amazon's got it now online, as well as our own website, which has a lot of other interesting Oklahoma history materials and articles, by the way. And, Pat, that is my name, John, middle initial J. Dwyer, DWYER.com. Just hit the Buy Now button, and it ships the day that you order.
Wow. I want to talk about a couple things here before we go into the news at the bottom of the hour. What was the biggest surprise for you putting this book together? Was there something you uncovered or discovered that even you as a history buff weren't aware of, or gave you some new perspective?
Well, I feel like that I was a pauper now, Pat, when I started. When I look back at how much I have learned in the last decade, and I guess the single great thing that I learned, and again, this is why we wound up having 2 volumes, is how much incredible dramatic history happened in Oklahoma before the land runs, including, but also before the war between the states. You know, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, when we think of, well, gosh, was anybody even here? Maybe a few of the tribal members.
Right.
But no, there was incredible action and discoveries and drama that was going on a lot farther back than really any of us realize, even that grew up in Oklahoma.
Why do you think that's, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like that part of the story has been either forgotten or not told for a while. Why is that?
Well, I think a couple of reasons. One, hearkening back, we talked about the Grapes of Wrath dilemma earlier, where Oklahomans, coupled, Pat, with the fact that when that came out, Oklahoma not only was in the midst of the worst depression in the country's history, but also our own Dust Bowl. And also the wearing out in other parts of the state that weren't directly in the Dust Bowl, the wearing out of the land. So you had an agricultural-based economy that was worn out and was on the decline. And all of that, again, it economically challenged people. And the Grapes of Wrath seem to kind of baptize the idea that, wow, this is a sad, sorrowful, kind of a lesser place. And, in fact, look, all the people now are leaving and moving somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I think what that spawned was kind of the opposite of what you have in other places, sometimes like Texas, for instance, where there's this bravado and pride. Oklahomans felt like, wow, we need to keep our heads down, do our work, but we just need to get through the next day. And to me, that's part of what sets this state apart, is folks have real grit here because they sucked it up and they worked through hard times that most people, most states, most regions don't have a sense of, never had a sense of the depth and the degree that this state had to work through to get to where we are today.
John, we had a caller. He couldn't hold on through the break here. he wanted you to address, and he said, does he tackle it in the book here? The fact that we could have wound up being two states. He said one of which would have been Sequoia. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, great question. And what he's talking about there, Pat, is prior to Oklahoma statehood in 1907, for the roughly 20 years prior to that, this was called the Twin Territories. It was territorial, but there were actually two territories. There was the Indian Territory, which took the original name that all of modern-day Oklahoma, other than the Panhandle, was called Indian Territory from about 1820 on. Well, in 1890, they split and it became Oklahoma Territory, roughly west of I-35, and Indian Territory, roughly east of I-35. Well, the leadership of Indian Territory, which was comprised of those great Indian republics we talked about a while ago, that people, Green Country in this area, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, they decided, in the words of Bob Blackburn, Dr. Blackburn, the head of the Oklahoma Historical Society, that was the voice and effort, the Sequoia, the idea of a state of Sequoia named after the great Cherokee. It was the voice and effort of the Indian republics to affect their own state, to be in charge of their own destiny once more. So what they wanted to do, Pat, was to have this state of Sequoia that would replace Indian Territory, again, roughly east of I-35, which would include all of Green Country. They would be a state, and then there would be a separate state, western Oklahoma, that would be called Oklahoma. It was the Oklahoma Territory. Well, politics didn't just happen in 2016, right? Mm-hmm. You had Teddy Roosevelt and the Republicans in charge in Washington, and again, Republicans and Democrat parties back then were not the same conservative, liberal,
right,
clear break that they are now, but the Republicans in the Northeast looked at this as a southern conservative democratic state, and they said, in the making, they said, my goodness, we don't want two states like that to oppose us. So Roosevelt and the Republicans basically denied the effort of the tribes to have a state of Sequoia and two states that rather it became one state of Oklahoma.
Interesting. Let's go to the phones, take some calls here for John Dwyer. Let's start with Stephen. You're on the Pat Campbell Show. Good morning. How are you? Stephen, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, go ahead. Question?
Yeah, everyone talks about the Jewish community here in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, but do you have anything in your book about the Jewish community that was out in the Panhandle prior to the land grab?
I do not, Stephen. That is, once again, we talked earlier about you're only a comment or a conversation away from humility when you're a historian, and so you've given that to me again, because I was not familiar with a distinct community of Jewish folks in the Panhandle, but I'd love to learn about that. And in our volume 2 picks up in 1911 and moves forward over the last century. So if it took place during this past century, I'd love to get something in there about it. If you want to, reach out to me through our website, which is John J. Dwyer. It's middle initial J, DWYER, johnjdwyer.com, and I'd love to learn more about that and reflect that in volume 2.
Yeah, Stephen, you've piqued my curiosity. What do you know about it?
Well, my grandmother was a part of the community out there.
How big of a community was it? Do you know?
It really wasn't that big. It was just a few families.
Okay. But
they had the stores there, and they would get together and keep Shabbat together. Uh-huh. There was no, as far as my grandmother told me, that she didn't know of any actual synagogue out there.
Right.
But there was a Jewish community out there in the Panhandle. And, it's just a little bit of what people have talked about, but it's not really anything that, other than my grandmother and a few other people have told me about.
Well, give John, get in contact with John, and maybe he can dig into it and find out some more. Stephen, I thank you so much for the call. Appreciate it. Hey, John, when you're putting together a book like this, a book of this magnitude, you mentioned that it's taken you 10 years to compile stuff. Where do you go? I mean, there's pictures in here, there's stories in here that a lot of people have never seen, never heard. Where do you go? How do you put something like this together?
Well, with fear and trembling, Pat. It really is. It's almost, there were times I felt like Captain Ahab pursuing Moby Dick, that it was going to, take me down into the depths with him, and I was never going to get to the end of it. And even now, it's the end of Volume 1, but we've still got another one to go. But I would say that, first of all, you have to take the 30,000-foot view. You have to survey and look over the great landscape of the overall story. So one of the first things I did was I read every Oklahoma history book that to my knowledge, that's ever been produced, so
wow.
I could find out what had already been done. But importantly, and this is one thing that Dr. Blackburn, the head of the Historical Society, cautioned me about, because he was kind of my mentor through this whole decade-long process. He said, what we want to do is make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes that have been in these previous Oklahoma history books, because a lot of times they will just pass on. They won't.
Okay, give me an example of a mistake.
Oh, let's see. What would a mistake be? Well, this would be maybe a larger theme, but how many of us knew growing up in Oklahoma that the Civil War not only took place here, but there were dozens of not just skirmishes, but battles, that it was the most costly event in Oklahoma history in terms of percentage of the population that was wounded, that died, property destruction. So that's kind of on a larger scale, that just the ignorance that we do not know that this happened all around us. And, of course, a lot of it happened around here, around the Tulsa, Creek Country, Green Country area, the Cherokee Country, but it extended south, even as far as southwest Oklahoma as Fort Cobb. But there were innumerable little examples of situations where, for instance, there would be the wrong name, or there would be two names of, say, Indian chiefs that were merged into one person. And what we would find out as we studied was, well, wait a minute. For instance, the Seminoles, the Bowlegs, Caesar Bowlegs and Billy Bowlegs. Some of the books, they just merged those into one person. They lived decades apart. Mm-hmm. So the average reader might not pick up on that, but you know how it is. If you have falsehood in a small place, that can lead to bigger problems. So, that's as far as back to your original question, though, of how to do this. You mentioned the images and the illustrations and the paintings in the book. Well, I crafted the course, the Oklahoma History course, for Southern Nazarene University, and we always meet the final class period at the state capitol in Oklahoma City. And I started noticing, Pat, through the years, this great gallery of Oklahoma historical art hanging on the walls and growing every time we went out there in the Capitol, and realizing that most of those works had not been in any Oklahoma history books. So I set about, realizing that they tell the story of Oklahoma through imagery and pictures. Yeah. That took over a year just to collect the illustrations that are in our book. But hopefully you've seen the book. Yep. Hopefully folks will think, well, that was time well spent. By the way, I was realizing during the break there, Pat, that that great gallery of historical art in the state capitol that just populates from one end of our book to the other, that was the passion project, and continues to be, of former longtime Tulsa State Senator Charles Ford. So he is the one that gets the credit. When you open this book up and see it, give a shout out to Charles Ford, because he's the one that made that possible, to have this beautiful historical art of Oklahoma in our book.
I had Doug Miller, I don't know if you're familiar with him, on the program earlier this week. He's got a book out, Fourth in Boston, The Heart of the Magic Empire. But we were talking about how and why Tulsa wound up where it is, how it started, who was involved. But he brought up something I want you to sort of comment on, the various tribes that were here. Some of the tribes saw the white man, the settler, as an opportunity. Some of the tribes were not as receptive and actually resented the infringement. So do you look into that in the book, and what did you find?
We do, and that gets back to our original premise, Pat, that great history is epic drama. And that's one of the things that's so strangling and suffocating about political correctness on all fronts. Political correctness says that there is a particular belief or way of doing things, and not only is that the only way that it can be done or believed, but other viewpoints are not even tolerated to be aired. Well, and is there any reason or any surprise that that most young people are not interested in history when it's presented in that truncated fashion.
Right.
Well, real history is much more exciting, much more complex. For instance, if you throw out a name, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners, the name Elias C. Boudinot or Boudinot, that will kindle probably a variety of views and responses, in particularly those with some Cherokee heritage. Was Elias C. Boudinot or Boudinot a sellout? Was he a corporate lackey for the railroads and others in the late 1800s?
Wasn't he killed too? That's in your book,
well,
right?
His father, Elias Boudinot, was killed.
Right.
Was killed in an intertribal strife among the Cherokees. But the other view would be Elias C. Boudinot. Was he a far-thinking American entrepreneur and pioneer who said, these railroads are coming through the Cherokee country, whether we like it or not.
Right.
Are we going to get run over by them, or are we going to get out in front of them and lead them?
Right.
And that led him, for instance, to found the town of Veneta against much opposition, not from the white man, but within his own tribe. Now, again, we need to be open and to having different views and discussion on this, but it sure makes for much more interesting history when you're reading through this Cherokee drama and thinking, well, I'm not sure if I agree with this guy or that guy, but we leave it sometimes to the reader to come up with their own viewpoint and not try to force feed it on them.
You actually got a picture in the book of the knife that killed his dad, a homemade knife. How'd you even find something like that? Where'd you come up with that?
Well, great illustration there, Pat, of how historiography needs to be done by folks that will roll up their sleeves. And I'll just tell you this, Dr. Blackburn, the Historical Society, told me that sometimes these Oklahoma history books are so boring because the people that write them are just a little bit lazy.
Yeah.
They don't get out and dig it up. And to the question of the knife that killed Elias Boudinot, would you believe that came from Chronicles of Oklahoma, the official state historical magazine, almost a century old now, a 1921 edition. It's been around that long, as well as the story of who used that knife. Well, who knew? So sometimes we're digging up new information. We want to always be on the cutting edge, but a lot of times, again, against political correctness, we want to go back and not forget what has already been learned and taught in the past. It would be very valuable for us today.
Let me squeeze a couple calls in here. Craig, you're on the Pat Campbell Show with John Dwyer. Question, comment?
Yes, John, appreciate your work. My family's been here since before the land run and had lived and bought land from the Owens. And anyway, they were kind of like somewhere between missionaries and just people of goodwill. And like J.P. Gumas was the first Sunday school superintendent of First Methodist when it was just like a hut. I was curious, did you trace anything about people who started schools or churches? And there's one fantastic story I'm going to have to confirm through my relatives, which is there were some shipments that didn't come to help the tribes, and they were going to attack the one street town of Tulsa. And my ancestor sat under a tree and negotiated for peace and stopped it. I've got to find out about this by getting someone from the other side who has a grandparent or somebody that told them that story, from the tribe side. But anyway, I was just curious, did you study anything about the faith people and the church and school people?
Yes, in fact, speaking, Craig, of political incorrectness, as Pat probably knows, one entire chapter in our book on that benighted time period of the 1840s and 50s. Remember I said at the outset of the hour that, wow, was anything happening in Oklahoma during that period?
Right.
Before the land runs, before the Civil War? Well, yeah, that chapter is entitled The Cross of Christ.
Yeah.
And it chronicles these valorous missionaries of multiple different denominations that in many cases the five civilized tribes asked them to come with them on their journeys, and they gave them encouragement. They built up their morale, of course, spiritual teaching. They helped the tribes spearhead the building of churches and schools to the point, Pat, where it was roundly acknowledged by the mid to late 1800s that the tribes in eastern Oklahoma, Green Country and surrounding area, they had better school systems than the white-dominated American states around Indian Territory.
Wow. John, we got to end on that note. Again, John J. Dwyer, the book, The Oklahomans, the story of Oklahoma and its people. If folks want to find out more about the book and you, where do we send them?
Go to John J., middle initial J. Dwyer, D-W-Y-E-R, johnjdwyer.com. You can get the book there. You can also get it at Tulsa Historical Society or on Amazon. And send me your questions. Craig and others and I will respond quickly.
John, thank you so much. Have a great day.